The subtle pop of the cork was a sound of pure luxury, a promise of effervescent celebration at 40,000 feet. But for 18-year-old Seraphina Monroe, it was the prelude to a quiet, chilling humiliation. The flight attendant, a woman named Carolyn with a smile as brittle as spun sugar, held the bottle of Dom Perignon aloft. Her eyes swept over Seraphina, clad in a simple cashmere hoodie, before settling on the older suit-clad man beside her. "Champagne, Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice dripping with deference. Then, turning to Seraphina, her tone shifted, becoming a syrupy, condescending whisper. "And a sparkling apple juice for the young lady?" The insult, so perfectly delivered, hung in the pressurized air of the cabin. Carolyn had made a grave miscalculation. She thought she was putting a child in her place, never realizing she was speaking to the woman who owned the very airframe they were flying in. The Gulfstream G700 tail number N1M sliced through the stratosphere with a serene indifference to the world below. Inside the cabin was a sanctuary of muted creams and polished walnut, a bespoke environment engineered to insulate its occupants from the realities of commercial travel. Every inch of it, from the hand-stitched leather seats to the advanced avionics in the cockpit, was a testament to the legacy of Monroe Aeronautics. It was a legacy that now rested squarely on the slender shoulders of Seraphina Monroe. At 18, Seraphina looked more like a student headed for a collegiate retreat than the newly minted CEO of a multi-billion-dollar aerospace empire. She was dressed in charcoal gray leggings, a simple black hoodie, and a pair of pristine sneakers that probably cost more than a round-trip ticket to Paris, though one would never know it by her unassuming demeanor. Tucked into her seat, she wasn't admiring the view or enjoying the amenities. She was engrossed in the schematics of a next-generation turbine engine displayed on a heavily encrypted tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. Beside her sat Arthur Vance, a man who had been her father's right hand for 3 decades. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his Savile Row suit immaculate. He carried an air of quiet authority, the kind that came from navigating boardroom battles and international contract law for a lifetime. He was her guardian, her advisor, and the last living link to the parents she had lost just 6 months prior in a tragic accident. Their deaths had thrust her from the protected world of an MIT freshman into the unforgiving stratosphere of corporate leadership. This flight to Geneva was not a vacation. It was her crucible. A merger was on the table, a deal so significant it would either cement her family's legacy or shatter it entirely. As the two of them had boarded the jet at the private terminal in Teterboro, New Jersey, they were greeted by the cabin crew. The lead flight attendant, Carolyn Hayes, stepped forward with a practiced, gleaming smile. Carolyn was a veteran of the private aviation world, a woman in her late 40s who prided herself on an almost psychic ability to anticipate the needs of the ultra-elite. Her internal calculus, honed over 20 years of service, was immediate and unflinching. She saw Arthur Vance, the age, the suit, the gravitas, and registered principal. Then she saw Seraphina, the youth, the casual attire, the focused intensity on a screen, and registered accessory. A daughter, perhaps. A much younger girlfriend, more likely. Or maybe her mind supplied with a flicker of disdain, one of those social media influencers who got invited along for the ride. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Vance," Carolyn had purred, taking his coat with a reverence reserved for royalty. "It's an honor to have you with us today. Please let me get you settled." Her greeting to Seraphina was a perfunctory, tight-lipped nod. "Ma'am," she'd said the word clipped and devoid of warmth. Seraphina, barely looking up from her tablet, had simply murmured, "Thank you," and moved past her to her preferred seat, oblivious to the judgment being rendered against her. Arthur, however, noticed. A subtle tightening around his eyes was the only sign, a micro-expression that Carolyn completely missed. He knew this would be a test for Sarah in more ways than one. The world was not accustomed to power looking like her. Now, as the jet reached its cruising altitude, Carolyn began her service. She approached their seating area, a silver tray in hand. "Mr. Vance, can I get you started with a drink? We have a wonderful 25-year-old Macallan, or perhaps a glass of the Dom Perignon." She offered her tone a perfect blend of respect and familiarity. "A coffee black would be perfect for now, Carolyn. Thank you," Arthur replied, his voice a calm baritone. "Of course." She then turned to Seraphina. The brilliant smile she'd given Arthur vanished, replaced by a look of strained patience. "And for you, orange juice, a soda." "I'll have a black coffee as well, please," Seraphina said, her eyes still glued to the complex engineering diagram on her screen. Carolyn paused, her lips thinning. The request seemed to annoy her, as if a teenager ordering black coffee was a pretentious affectation. "Of course," she repeated, but the two words sounded entirely different. The warmth was gone, replaced by a brittle professionalism. She returned minutes later, placing Arthur's coffee on the polished wood inlay next to him on a fine bone china saucer with a small silver spoon and a wrapped biscotti. For Seraphina, she simply placed a ceramic mug directly on the table with a clatter that was just a fraction too loud to be accidental. Seraphina didn't flinch, her focus absolute. This was Carolyn's art form, the subtle telegraphing of status. It was in the choice of glassware, the placement of a napkin, the temperature of a smile. She was a gatekeeper, and in her mind, this girl, this child, did not belong on this side of the gate. She saw a freeloader in a world she desperately aspired to be a part of. The fact that the girl was black only sharpened the edges of her prejudice, fitting neatly into a pre-written narrative in her mind. Carolyn felt a strange, proprietary ownership over the cabin, and Seraphina's presence felt like an intrusion, a violation of the natural order she so carefully curated. She was determined to make the girl feel as out of place as she believed her to be. The flight across the Atlantic was smooth, a silent journey through the deep, star-dusted velvet of the night sky. Inside the cabin of the Gulf Stream, however, a quiet turbulence was brewing, a current of microaggressions only perceptible to those paying attention. Seraphina, despite her intense focus on her work, was paying attention to everything. Carolyn continued her campaign of quiet condescension with the precision of a seasoned sniper. When Arthur requested a financial periodical, it appeared instantly on a silver platter. When Seraphina asked for the same, the Financial Times, Carolyn returned after a long pause with a copy of a glossy fashion magazine. "I'm afraid we don't have another copy of the Times, but I thought you might enjoy this," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, as she placed the magazine on the table, its cover featuring a vapid celebrity. Seraphina looked up from her tablet for the first time, her dark eyes meeting Carolyn's. There was no anger in her gaze, only a calm, unnerving clarity. "I'm sure it's fascinating," she said, her voice even, "but my tablet has a subscription. It's fine." She turned back to her work, dismissing Carolyn without another thought. The slight had been delivered, noted, and discarded. The passive-aggressive ballet continued. Arthur's water glass was constantly refilled with chilled Evian and a slice of lemon. Seraphina's sat empty until she finally had to ask for a refill, which was delivered without the lemon. A warm blanket was draped over Arthur's shoulders when the cabin cooled slightly. Seraphina was ignored. Liam, the junior flight attendant, watched from the galley with a growing sense of unease. He was new to the Monroe Executive Air Fleet, having been hired for his discretion and attention to detail. He saw what Carolyn was doing, and it made his skin crawl. He had seen the way Captain Miller himself had come out to the tarmac to personally greet the young woman, a gesture of respect reserved for the highest echelons of clientele. He had seen the name on the flight manifest, Monroe. It wasn't a difficult connection to make. Monroe Aeronautics, Monroe Executive Air, Miss Monroe. He was certain Carolyn's assumptions were catastrophically wrong, but he was too green, too intimidated by her seniority to say anything. He just kept his head down, trying to subtly compensate for his colleague's hostility, ensuring Seraphina's coffee mug was kept full and offering her snacks with a genuine smile that stood in stark contrast to Carolyn's icy facade. Seraphina noticed his kindness rewarding him with a brief but warm smile that made him feel seen. An hour before their descent into Geneva, a message alert chimed on Seraphina's tablet. She read it, and for the first time the tension in her shoulders eased. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She had been negotiating a minor but crucial prerequisite for the merger via a secure channel, and her counterpart in Geneva had just conceded the point. It was a small victory, but it was her victory. It was the first domino to fall in a very long, very complex line. In that moment, she felt the weight of the last 6 months a lift just enough to let her breathe. Her parents had always celebrated every victory, big or small, with a toasting. It was their tradition. She decided in that moment to honor it. She looked up, catching Carolyn's eye as she passed through the cabin. "Excuse me," Seraphina said, her voice quiet but clear. Carolyn stopped, her posture radiating impatience. "Yes. I'd like a glass of champagne, please." The request hung in the air. It was the moment Carolyn had been waiting for, the ultimate confirmation of her judgment. The spoiled child, the party girl, was finally showing her true colors. She wanted to drink. A triumphant, vindictive glint appeared in Carolyn's eyes. She was about to put this girl firmly in her place, not just as a flight attendant to a passenger, but as a worldly adult to a naive child. This was her chance to exercise the authority she felt Seraphina's very presence was mocking. She would enjoy this. Carolyn's professional smile returned, but it was sharper now, a weaponized version of her usual customer service expression. "Of course," she said, her voice a silken trap. She walked to the galley, the deliberate, measured click of her heels on the cabin floor announcing her purpose. She didn't select a flute from the rack. Instead, she retrieved the chilled bottle of Dom Pérignon, an unopened spare, and a polished silver corkscrew. She returned not to Seraphina, but to the small service bar built into the bulkhead in full view of her passengers. With practiced flair, she peeled the foil from the cork, undid the wire cage, and aimed the bottle away. The pop was soft and satisfying. She poured a small amount into a flute to check the effervescence, the tiny bubbles racing to the surface. It was a perfect pour. The entire display was a piece of theater designed to heighten the coming refusal. She turned, holding the bottle, and a single, elegant crystal flute. She walked directly to Arthur Vance. "Mr. Vance, I've opened a fresh bottle," she announced, her voice resonating with warmth. "Would you care for a glass to celebrate our impending arrival in Geneva?" Arthur, who had been observing the entire exchange, slowly lowered the report he was reading. He looked from Carolyn's smug face to Seraphina's calm, waiting expression. He understood this was a test, and not for him. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, thank you, Carolyn. I'm fine." Carolyn's smile didn't falter. This was even better. She now had the stage to herself. She turned to Seraphina, her body language shifting from deferential servant to condescending authority figure. She held the single flute out, not to offer it, but as a prop in her little drama. "Honey," she began the endearment, a poisoned dart. "I'm sorry, but I simply can't serve you alcohol. I'm sure you understand. Company policy is very strict about serving minors." The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The only sound was the gentle hum of the Rolls-Royce engines keeping them aloft. Seraphina looked at Carolyn, her expression unreadable. "I am 18 years old," she stated. It wasn't an argument. It was a simple declaration of fact. Carolyn let out a small, patronizing laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you are. But you look so young, and without a valid physical government ID in my hand, I can't take the risk. It's more than my job is worth." She then made her most critical error. She looked to Arthur, seeking an ally, an adult, to back her up against the petulant child. "You understand, of course, Mr. Vance. I'm just looking out for your interests and protecting the integrity of the charter." Arthur Vance remained silent. His stillness was more damning than any outburst could have been. He simply met Carolyn's gaze, his eyes like chips of ice. He did not nod. He did not offer his support. He simply watched a silent arbiter giving Seraphina the floor to handle her own battle. The lack of support from the man she'd identified as the principal threw Carolyn for a loop, but she recovered quickly, doubling down on her perceived authority. "How about a nice sparkling cider instead? I can even put it in a flute for you if you'd like. It will be our little secret." The condescension was suffocating. She was treating the CEO of the airline like a toddler at a grown-ups party. Seraphina did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger. She simply held Carolyn's gaze and spoke with a chillingly formal precision that was utterly at odds with her youthful appearance. "That will not be necessary," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of absolute command. "However, I do require you to do something for me. Please take out your service tablet and log this incident in your official post-flight report. Note the time, the altitude, and your explicit reason for the service refusal. Please be as detailed as possible. Quote me directly. Note that I informed you of my legal age and that you refused service anyway." Carolyn stared, her smile finally faltering. This was not the reaction she expected. There was no whining, no tantrum, no appeal to Mr. Vance. There was only a calm corporate directive. The request was so bizarre, so procedural, that it knocked her completely off balance. Why would anyone ask for their own misbehavior to be officially documented? I don't see the need for that." Carolyn stammered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. "I do," Seraphina replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Please do it now." She then broke eye contact, turned back to her own tablet, and resumed her work, as if the conversation was over, and as if Carolyn Hayes no longer existed. The dismissal was so absolute, so complete, that it was more powerful than any shout. The power dynamic in the cabin had just fractured, and Carolyn was beginning to suspect she was standing on the wrong side of the fault line. Shaken and confused, Carolyn retreated to the forward galley, her self-righteous anger now diluted with a strange, creeping dread. She slammed the champagne bottle onto the small counter, the sound echoing her frustration. Liam, who had been discreetly preparing landing refreshments, looked up, his expression worried. "Is everything okay?" "It's just this girl," Carolyn hissed, her voice a harsh whisper. "Unbelievably entitled. Demanding champagne, and then, when I refuse, she gets all high and mighty telling me to log it. Can you believe the nerve?" She began polishing a glass with unnecessary vigor, her movements jerky and agitated. "She's trying to get me in trouble, it's obvious. Probably thinks she can complain and get a free flight out of it. I've seen her type before." But Liam wasn't listening to her justifications. He was replaying the scene in his mind, the girl's unnatural calm, Mr. Vance's pointed silence, and the bizarrely formal request to document the incident. It didn't add up. People who were in the wrong didn't ask for a paper trail. "Carolyn," he said slowly, his voice low, "I really don't think this is a good idea. I think you've made a mistake." The only mistake was letting a child like that on board without a proper chaperone. She snapped, her prejudice blinding her to the warning signs. "She's Mr. Vance's problem, not mine. He's the client." "Is he?" Liam asked quietly. He gestured to the sleek service tablet mounted on the galley wall. "Have you actually looked at the passenger manifest for this flight?" "I don't need to look at a manifest to know who's paying the bills." Carolyn scoffed. 20 years in this business teaches you to read people, Liam. You'll learn that. You can't just rely on what the screen tells you. Ignoring her condescending tone, Liam swiped the screen to life. He tapped on the flight number N1M, and the passenger list appeared in crisp digital font. He turned the tablet so Carolyn could see it. The screen read, Flight Log ME-A 771, Teterboro, Geneva, Aircraft Gulfstream G700, The Odyssey. Status en route. Passenger information PAX 1. Monroe, Seraphina Principal, Owner, PAX 2, Vance, Arthur Guest. Carolyn's eyes scanned the first line, then the second. Her brain processed the words, but the meaning refused to sink in. She read them again and again. The color drained from her face, leaving a pasty, sickly pallor behind. Principal. Owner. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, mocking her. Every dismissive glance, every cold shoulder, every condescending word she had uttered in the past few hours replayed in her mind. But now they were cast in a horrifying new light. The fashion magazine, the lukewarm coffee, the refusal, the logged refusal. She felt a wave of nausea so intense she had to grip the counter to steady herself. Her breath hitched in her throat. The girl in the hoodie wasn't a guest. She wasn't a +1. She wasn't an influencer. She was a Monroe. She was the Monroe. She owned the plane. She owned the company. She owned Carolyn's entire career. "No," she whispered the word, a strangled gasp. "It can't be. She's just a kid." "She's Seraphina Monroe," Liam said, his voice barely audible. "Her parents, they died earlier this year, Don and Evelyn Monroe. She inherited everything." The realization hit Carolyn like a physical blow. She remembered the news stories now, the tragic headlines about the famed aviation power couple. She remembered the blurry photo of a grieving daughter, a young woman shielded from the cameras by a somber-looking man. The man was Arthur Vance. "Oh my God," Carolyn breathed, stumbling back against the wall. "What have I done?" Her carefully constructed world, built on her supposed ability to read the wealthy, had just crumbled into dust. Her greatest professional asset, her judgment, was revealed to be nothing more than a container for her ugliest, most base prejudices. She hadn't been reading people. She had been projecting her own resentments and stereotypes onto them. She looked through the galley doorway into the main cabin. She saw Seraphina still quietly working on her tablet, the picture of serene focus. She didn't look like a vengeful goddess or a corporate tyrant. She looked like a young woman with the weight of the world on her shoulders, and Carolyn, in a fit of arrogant pique, had just added to that weight. "I have to fix this," Carolyn whispered, her mind racing frantically. "I'll go out there. I'll apologize. I'll bring her the whole bottle. I'll explain it was a misunderstanding." Liam looked at her with pity. "Carolyn," he said softly, I don't think an apology is what she wants." He was right. Seraphina Monroe hadn't wanted champagne. She had wanted respect. And it was the one thing Carolyn Hayes was now incapable of giving her. The Gulfstream touched down on the tarmac at Geneva Airport with the gentle precision of a falling feather. As the jet taxied to its designated spot at the executive terminal, a sleek black Mercedes S-Class pulled up its engine, a low purr. The ground crew moved with an efficiency that bordered on reverence. Before the engines had even spooled down completely, the cabin door was opened. Seraphina and Arthur stood gathering their briefcases. Seraphina slipped her tablet into its case, her movements fluid and unhurried. She didn't so much as glance towards the galley where Carolyn was hiding, paralyzed by fear. As she passed Liam, who was standing by the door, she paused. "Thank you for your excellent service, Liam," she said, her voice warm and genuine. She met his eyes, and he saw not a trace of the conflict that had transpired. He saw only a composed, powerful young woman. "It was my pleasure, Ms. Monroe," he managed to say, his voice filled with relief and gratitude. Then she was gone, descending the air stairs with Arthur at her side and disappearing into the waiting sedan which sped away towards the city. Carolyn finally emerged from the galley, her face a mask of desperation. She watched the Mercedes disappear, a frantic hope rising in her that maybe, just maybe, the incident would be forgotten, chalked up to a misunderstanding. Maybe the young CEO was too preoccupied with her big meeting to worry about a flight attendant's blunder. It was a foolish hope, and she knew it. Hours later, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking Lake Geneva, no one would have recognized the quiet girl from the plane. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored navy blue suit, Seraphina Monroe commanded the room. The casual, unassuming demeanor was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp intellect and an encyclopedic knowledge of her company's operations. She stood before a board of grizzled Swiss and German executives men twice her age, who had been openly skeptical about negotiating with an 18-year-old. Their skepticism had evaporated within the first 10 minutes. She didn't just talk about financials. She debated the merits of cobalt versus titanium alloys in turbine blade manufacturing. She didn't just present projections. She deconstructed their competitors' supply chain weaknesses from memory. She parried their aggressive questions with calm, data-driven answers, her voice never rising, her confidence absolute. Arthur Vance sat beside her, a silent partner intervening only to clarify a point of international law. This was her show, and she was brilliant. The negotiation was for the acquisition of Davies International's aerospace division, a move that would give Monroe Aeronautics a near monopoly on the private long-haul jet market. It was an audacious, high-stakes play her father had set in motion before he died. Now, it was up to her to close it. The final sticking point was the Charter Services Division, Monroe Executive Heir. Mr. Davies, the stern elderly chairman of the opposing company, was concerned about brand dilution. "Your executive fleet has a reputation for excellence, Ms. Monroe," he said, his German accent precise. "But my clients are particular. They are accustomed to a flawless standard of service. Any perceived drop in quality, any inconsistency, and they will leave. How can you guarantee that your standard will meet ours?" This was the opening Seraphina had been waiting for. A thoughtful expression crossed her face. "You are absolutely right to be concerned, Mr. Davies," she began, her tone collaborative. "A brand is a promise. And the promise of Monroe Executive Heir is not just luxury, but intuitive, respectful, and discreet service. It's a promise that every passenger, regardless of their age, their appearance, or their demeanor, is treated as the principal. Because on our jets, they are." She paused, letting her words sink in. In fact, I experienced an incident on my flight over here this morning that highlighted the critical need for constant vigilance in this area. It revealed a weakness in our service protocol, a vulnerability to individual staff prejudice that I intend to personally correct. She then laid out in impersonal strategic terms a new three-pronged initiative for the charter fleet. It involved enhanced psychological screening for cabin crew, a rigorous new training program focused on unconscious bias, and a zero-tolerance policy for what she termed discretionary service failures incidents, where service was denied or degraded based on an employee's personal judgment rather than explicit safety protocols. "The Monroe standard will not just meet yours, Mr. Davies," she concluded, her eyes locking with his. "It will exceed it. My name is on the tail of every jet. I consider any failure in service to be a personal failure, and I do not fail." The room was silent. Mr. Davies stared at her, his stern expression slowly melting into one of grudging admiration and then genuine respect. He pushed a pen across the vast mahogany table. "You have a deal, Ms. Monroe," he said. The acquisition was signed. Seraphina had not only honored her father's legacy, she had just expanded it beyond his wildest dreams. And in doing so, she had also sealed Carolyn Hayes's fate. The return flight to Teterboro was scheduled for the following morning. When Carolyn Hayes saw the passenger manifest, her heart plummeted. Monroe, Seraphina principal/owner, Vance, Arthur, guest. Her desperate hope that they might take a different jet or that she might be reassigned was crushed. She would have to face her accuser in the very same cabin where she had committed her career-ending sin. The atmosphere on the plane before their arrival was thick with a funereal tension. Liam moved about his duties with quiet, nervous efficiency, avoiding Carolyn's gaze. Carolyn, for her part, looked like she hadn't slept. Her makeup couldn't conceal the dark circles under her eyes, and her usually crisp uniform seemed to hang off her as if she had physically shrunk overnight. She had spent the night replaying every moment, every word, her stomach churning with a toxic cocktail of regret and fear. When Seraphina and Arthur boarded, the transformation was jarring. Seraphina was no longer in student-like casual wear. She wore the same sharp business suit from her meeting, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She radiated an aura of immense, potent authority. She looked every bit the corporate titan she now was. She walked past Carolyn without a flicker of recognition, as if she were a piece of the cabin's furniture. She took her seat and immediately opened a leather-bound folio, Arthur sitting opposite her. For the first hour of the flight, there was only silence, punctuated by the rustle of papers. Carolyn and Liam served a pre-ordered meal, their movements stilted and robotic. Carolyn tried to be overly solicitous to Seraphina, her hands trembling as she poured her water, her voice a reedy, pathetic version of its usual confident tone. Seraphina ignored her completely, directing any requests she had through Liam. Then, once they had reached cruising altitude and the meal service was cleared, Seraphina closed her folio. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice calm and clear, speaking into the cabin's intercom. "When you have a moment, could you please join us in the main cabin?" A moment later, the cockpit door opened, and the uniformed captain, a distinguished man in his 50s, entered. "Ms. Monroe," he said respectfully. "Captain, please have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair adjacent to them. "Mr. Vance and I were just discussing the future of Monroe Executive Heir. As you know, we have successfully acquired the Davies International Aerospace Division." "Congratulations, ma'am. That's incredible news," the captain said, genuinely impressed. "Thank you," Seraphina replied. "The acquisition brings with it a significant expansion of our VIP clientele. It's imperative that our service standards are not just maintained, but elevated to a level that is beyond reproach. Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting. She turned her gaze from the captain and for the first time looked directly at Carolyn Hayes, who was standing frozen near the galley. "Carolyn Liam, would you please join us?" she asked. It was not a request. The two flight attendants approached Liam, looking pale, and Carolyn looking positively ill. They stood before the seated group like defendants at a tribunal. "As part of our new service initiative," Seraphina continued, her voice devoid of any emotion, "we are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for service failures that compromise the integrity of the Monroe brand. Integrity, to be clear, is built on trust, respect, and impartiality. It is eroded by assumption and prejudice." She looked at Arthur. "Mr. Vance, would you please read your notes from the flight to Geneva yesterday?" Arthur opened his own folio. In his precise, lawyerly voice, he began to read a dispassionate, chronologically ordered list of observations. At 08:15 EST, passenger Monroe was offered juice or soda, while passenger Vance was offered premium alcoholic beverages and coffee. At 09:30, passenger Monroe's request for the Financial Times was denied, and she was offered a fashion magazine instead. At 11:00, passenger Monroe's water glass, which had been empty for approximately 45 minutes, was refilled only upon her direct request. At 14:20, he paused, his voice steady. Passenger Monroe's direct request for a single glass of champagne was refused. The stated reason by Flight Attendant Hayes was suspicion that the passenger was a minor, despite the passenger's verbal confirmation that she was of legal drinking age. Flight Attendant Hayes then attempted to solicit my agreement to override the passenger's request. He stopped reading and looked up, his gaze resting on Carolyn. The formal, detailed account was 1,000 times more damning than a heated accusation. It was cold, hard, and irrefutable. A desperate, choked sound escaped Carolyn's lips. Her composure, already fragile, shattered completely. "It was a misunderstanding," she pleaded, her voice cracking. She looked directly at Seraphina, her eyes swimming with panicked tears. "I swear I thought you were underage. You look so young, and I was just trying to be responsible. I was trying to protect the company, protect Mr. Vance's account. I was just doing my job." Seraphina listened to the torrent of excuses, her expression an unreadable mask of calm. When Carolyn finally trailed off, sniffling, Seraphina spoke, her voice cutting through the cabin's tense silence like a shard of ice. "No," she said simply. "You are not doing your job. Your job is to provide exemplary service to the clients of this airline. You did not do that. You were not protecting the company. You made a series of assumptions based on my race and my age. You assumed I was not the client. You assumed I was insignificant. You assumed I was a child who needed to be managed. You saw what you wanted to see, not the reality that was in front of you." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intensifying. "You did not refuse me champagne because you thought I was a minor. You refused me because in your eyes I didn't belong here. It was a power play, a petty, misguided attempt to assert a sense of superiority over a passenger you had already judged and dismissed. You were not acting out of policy. You were acting out of prejudice, and that is a liability this company can no longer afford." Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall that Carolyn could not hope to scale. All her excuses, all her justifications were rendered meaningless. "My parents," Seraphina continued, her voice softening for a moment with a flicker of pain before hardening again, "built this company on a single guiding principle. Excellence is blind. It does not care what you look like, where you come from, how old you are, or who you love. It only recognizes the standard. You, Ms. Hayes, have failed to meet that standard in the most fundamental way imaginable. The sentence hung in the air, final and absolute. Effective upon our landing at Teterboro, your employment with Monroe Executive Heir is terminated, Seraphina stated. You will be met by head of security who will escort you from the premises. Your final effects will be couriered to you. A sob broke from Carolyn's throat. It was the sound of a career unraveling in real time. Seraphina then turned her attention to the pale, ramrod-straight junior attendant. Liam, she said, her tone shifting entirely, becoming warmer, more direct. Your own detailed incident report, which you filed internally from the galley mid-flight yesterday, was the first thing I read this morning. It was factual, precise, and demonstrated an exceptional level of integrity and situational awareness. Your professionalism under difficult circumstances has been noted. She gave him a small, appreciative nod. The Vice President of In-Flight Services will be contacting you next week to discuss your advancement to a lead attendant position and your role in our new training initiative. Liam could only stammer, "Thank you, Ms. Monroe. Thank you." Seraphina acknowledged him with a slight incline of her head. Then her gaze drifted past the devastated, weeping figure of Carolyn Hayes, as if she were no longer there. She looked towards the front of the cabin at the small, well-stocked bar. "Arthur," she said, her voice now light, the business of the day concluded. "Please get me that glass of champagne. We have a multi-billion-dollar acquisition to celebrate." As Arthur Vance rose and walked to the bar, the familiar pop of a cork echoed once more through the cabin. This time it wasn't a prelude to humiliation. It was the sound of a new era beginning an era, led by a woman who had proven beyond any doubt that she belonged exactly where she was. As Arthur poured the golden bubbling liquid into a crystal flute, Carolyn Hayes stood broken, a ghost in a uniform she no longer had the right to wear, utterly and irrevocably grounded. The final hour of the flight was a masterclass in psychological pressure. The air in the cabin, scrubbed clean and perfectly climate-controlled, felt thick and suffocating. Carolyn Hayes remained standing, rooted to the spot near the galley, a living statue of professional ruin. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving behind tight, salty tracks on her foundation. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic and denial, was now eerily quiet, stunned into submission by the finality of Seraphina's judgment. She was a ghost on her own flight, visible to all, but acknowledged by none. Seraphina, in stark contrast, was the picture of calm productivity. She sipped her champagne slowly, the delicate bubbles a quiet counterpoint to the drone of the engines. She and Arthur spoke in low, measured tones, reviewing the terms of the Davies acquisition, planning the integration of the new assets, and outlining a timeline for the press release. To an outside observer, they were simply two executives wrapping up a successful business trip. The raw, brutal act of terminating an employee that had just occurred might as well have happened in another lifetime. This, Carolyn realized with a fresh wave of horror, was the most chilling part. For Seraphina Monroe, firing her wasn't a dramatic climax. It was a checklist item, a loose end to be tied up with dispassionate efficiency before moving on to the next, more important task. It was business. Liam moved with a new, quiet authority. He collected the champagne flutes, offered coffee refills, and prepared the cabin for landing, all while meticulously avoiding the dead space around Carolyn. He was no longer just a junior attendant. He was the sole representative of the cabin crew, the de facto lead by default. His movements were crisp, his demeanor impeccable. He was already stepping into the role that had been promised to him, his professionalism, a silent rebuke to the woman who had crumbled beside him. As the Gulf Stream began its final descent into New Jersey, the familiar landscape of suburbs and highways spreading out below the sterile quiet was finally broken. Seraphina looked up from her documents, her gaze sweeping over the cabin before landing for the last time on Carolyn. "Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice neutral, "I advise you to take a seat for landing." The simple, safety-oriented instruction was the cruelest kindness. It was a reminder that even in her disgrace, the rules of aviation still applied. Numbly, Carolyn stumbled to the aft jump seat, strapping herself in, with hands that felt like foreign objects. She stared out the small porthole window, but she didn't see the runway approaching. She saw 20 years of service, 20 years of pride, and perceived status rushing up to meet the ground and shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The touchdown was, as always, flawless. The jet taxied with a gentle hum to its private hangar, a sprawling, gleaming white structure emblazoned with the familiar stylized M of the Monroe logo. As the engine spooled down into a final profound silence, the main cabin door was unlatched. Standing at the bottom of the air stairs was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. His posture was military straight, his expression unreadable. This was Marcus Thorne, the head of corporate security for Monroe Aeronautics, a man whose presence signaled a problem was being resolved. Seraphina and Arthur stood gathering their things. Seraphina paused at the top of the stairs, the bright late-morning sun catching in her hair. She looked at Marcus and gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying easily in the quiet hangar. "Thank you for meeting us. Please handle this matter with the utmost discretion. The company car is waiting." "Of course, Ms. Monroe. It's waiting just outside," he replied, his voice a low rumble. Without another glance at the cabin's interior, Seraphina descended the stairs and walked towards a waiting town car her journey over. Her karmic retribution had been delivered, and she had already moved on. Marcus Thorne ascended the stairs, his large frame filling the doorway. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Carolyn. He ignored Liam, who was already beginning his post-flight checks. "Carolyn Hayes?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am here to escort you from the premises." He stated his tone flat and impersonal. "Please gather your personal handbag. A car will take you to a single local destination. Any other personal effects in your locker will be catalogued and couriered to you by the end of the week." A final desperate surge of defiance flared within Carolyn. "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "I have rights. I need to speak with HR. This isn't right." Marcus didn't blink. "Your exit interview and all relevant paperwork from Human Resources have already been dispatched to your personal email. A generous severance package conditional on the signing of a non-disclosure agreement has been included. All of your questions will be answered in that documentation. My instructions, however, are to see you off the property immediately. Please do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." The cold, procedural nature of his words extinguished her final spark of resistance. This was a process, a well-oiled machine for removing a faulty part, and she was the part. Defeated, she grabbed her handbag. As Marcus led her toward the door, she caught Liam's eye. She saw no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. She saw only a profound and solemn pity, which was somehow worse than anything else. The walk across the tarmac and through the executive lounge was the longest walk of her life. The ground crew, the pilots, the administrative staff, they all seemed to be watching from the corners of their eyes. Whispers followed her like a foul wind. The world she had lorded over, the domain where her smile could make or break a client's day, had become a gauntlet of shame. She was no longer Carolyn, the polished veteran flight attendant. She was an outcast. Less than an hour later, Seraphina Monroe stood in the main boardroom on the top floor of Monroe Tower. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the New York City skyline. Here, surrounded by her executive team, she was not a young woman in a hoodie, but a commander in her element. The Davies acquisition gives us an unprecedented market share, she was saying, her voice resonating with confidence. But it also brings a new level of scrutiny. Our brand must be synonymous with absolute, unassailable excellence. That excellence begins with our people. She looked at Eleanor Vance, the sharp, impeccably dressed vice president of in-flight services. Eleanor, I'm greenlighting the complete overhaul of our cabin crew training program effective immediately. I'm calling it the Monroe Standard. I want a new module focused on identifying and dismantling unconscious bias. I want psychological screenings that test for prejudice and entitlement. And I want a system of accountability that is swift and unambiguous. She continued, We will reward integrity as swiftly as we punish prejudice. To that end, you will be promoting junior attendant Liam O'Connell to lead attendant. He is to be fast-tracked for a trainer position. His detailed factual report of the service failure on Flight MEA 771 will be the first case study in our new training module. He demonstrated the exact standard of conduct I expect from every employee who wears our uniform. Eleanor nodded, already making notes on her tablet. Consider it done, Sarah. I'll call him this afternoon. After the meeting, Arthur lingered as the other executives filed out. He looked at his young ward, a deep sense of pride in his eyes. Your father would have fired her with a lot more shouting, he said with a wry smile. Your mother would have quietly redesigned the entire corporate structure so that a person like that could never get hired in the first place. He paused, his expression softening. You, Sarah, did both. You are the perfect synthesis of their best qualities. For the first time since the ordeal began, a flicker of the immense strain she was under showed in Seraphina's eyes. It had to be done, Arthur, she said quietly. It wasn't a choice. It was a responsibility. The Monroe name means something. It's not just on the tail of the jets. It's on every paycheck, every contract, every bolt and rivet. I won't allow anyone to tarnish it. Meanwhile, Carolyn Hayes sat in the back of a silent corporate car, watching the familiar landscape of her life blur past the window. She had been dropped off at her own front door like a misdelivered package. Inside her empty, quiet condo, the reality began to set in. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled to the number of a well-connected recruiter in the corporate aviation world. Mark, it's Carolyn Hayes, she said, forcing a brightness into her voice that she didn't feel. Carolyn. To what do I owe the pleasure? He asked. Well, it's funny. She began launching into a pre-rehearsed story about wanting a new challenge about leaving Monroe on good terms. The line was silent for a long moment. Carolyn. Mark said, his voice suddenly cool and distant. I think you should know the word is already out. Whatever happened on that flight to Geneva, it's out. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do for you. My advice, consider a different industry. The click of the phone disconnecting was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of every door in her professional world slamming shut at once. Her prejudice hadn't just cost her a job, it had cost her her entire career. Miles away, Liam O'Connell was in his small apartment, his uniform hanging neatly on his closet door. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number with the Monroe corporate prefix. He answered hesitantly. Mr. O'Connell, this is Eleanor Vance, VP of In-Flight Services at Monroe Executive Air. Liam stood straighter, his heart pounding. He listened in stunned silence as Ms. Vance explained the promotion, the pay raise, and the new incredible responsibility of becoming a trainer for the Monroe Standard. Ms. Monroe was exceptionally impressed with your integrity, Eleanor finished. She believes you are the future of our service. We hope you'll accept. Yes. Liam breathed, his voice thick with emotion. Of course, yes. Thank you. After the call ended, he walked over to his closet and looked at the uniform. It looked different now. It wasn't just a set of clothes for a job. It was a mantle of responsibility. He had witnessed a failure of character and a triumph of leadership. And in the quiet hum of his apartment, he made a silent vow to himself and to the young woman who now owned the sky that he would be worthy of the trust placed in him. The ripples of Seraphina's decision had spread, and while they had drowned one career in a sea of its own making, they were lifting another toward a brighter horizon. The story of Seraphina Monroe and the flight attendant who misjudged her is more than just a tale of karma served at 40,000 feet. It's a powerful real-life reminder that prejudice is a profound liability and underestimation is a fool's game. True power and authority are not conveyed by a suit, an age, or a skin color. They are demonstrated through intelligence, integrity, and decisive action. Carolyn Hayes didn't just lose her job. She lost the opportunity to be a part of a future being built by the very person she tried to diminish. Seraphina's quiet strength teaches us that the greatest response to prejudice is not anger, but excellence. It's a reminder that the person you dismiss today might be the one who owns the jet and your future tomorrow. What did you think of Carolyn's karmic lesson? Have you ever been underestimated in a similar way? Share your own stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message and subscribe for more true stories of justice and empowerment.